The television series showed us Chernobyl's workers facing an invisible disaster. But what actually happened to them after the explosion? The honest answer is harder and more human than either they all died or they were fine. Different people entered the disaster at different times, did different jobs, absorbed different doses, and had very different fates. At 1:23 and 43 seconds in the morning of April 26, 1986, Unit 4 was torn apart. Senior reactor operator Valery Kodenchuk was killed in the explosion. His body was never recovered. The destroyed reactor became his grave. Commissioning engineer Vladimir Shashanok was crushed and badly burned when structures collapsed. He was carried from the plant, but died from those injuries later that morning. Those two immediate deaths matter because they are often folded into a radiation count. The United Nations scientific assessment keeps them separate. 2 workers died from traumatic injuries in the immediate aftermath. They were not 2 of the 28 early deaths attributed to acute radiation syndrome. Then came the people who stayed inside, searched damaged rooms, fought fires, isolated equipment, and tried to stop the accident spreading into the other units. The World Health Organization says about 600 workers were on the site in the early morning. 134 received doses high enough to develop acute radiation syndrome. Acute radiation syndrome is not a timer that kills everyone after the same number of days. At very high whole-body doses, radiation destroys bone marrow and damages skin and internal organs. But the outcome changes sharply with dose, injury, and treatment. The recorded doses for those patients stretched from about 0.8 to 16 gray. That is not a small variation around one typical exposure. It is a 20-fold range. The United Nations assessment says external whole-body radiation and beta radiation to the skin dominated, while internal contamination played a smaller role in these acute cases. Bone marrow failure was the main contributor to the early radiation deaths. 28 of those 134 workers died in the next few months. The majority survived the acute period. But survived is not the same as unharmed. Recovery from acute radiation syndrome could take years. Damage to bone marrow left patients vulnerable to infection and bleeding, while beta radiation caused severe skin injuries. Many survivors later developed radiation-related cataracts. The scientific record, therefore, has at least 3 outcomes even inside this small cohort: early death, survival with lasting injury, and survival without every later illness being traceable to the accident. Some named stories show that range. Unit 4 Shift Chief Alexander Akimov and reactor engineer Leonid Toptonov both died from radiation sickness in May. Fire Chief Leonid Telyatnikov received a high dose, survived treatment, returned to service, and lived until 2004. His later death should not be assigned a cause that the record does not give. So even among the most exposed first responders, there was no single clock and no single ending. A few days later came another group whose fate is often told incorrectly. Water remained in the pressure-suppression pool beneath the wrecked reactor. Officials feared that hot reactor material reaching it could cause another steam explosion. Plant workers Oleksiy Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov entered the lower levels and opened valves so the water could be removed. The plant says that removal was completed by May 6th. Later retellings often say the 3 men died within days. They did not. In July 2019, Ananenko and Bespalov stood in person to receive the Hero of Ukraine award. Baranov's son accepted his father's posthumous award. Boris Baranov had died in 2005, almost 19 years after the accident. Their mission was dangerous. Correcting its ending does not make it less brave. And the first night was only the beginning. From 1986 through 1990, roughly 530,000 registered recovery workers took part in the response. They monitored radiation, decontaminated equipment, removed debris, transported material, and built the structure that enclosed the ruins. The World Health Organization gives their average effective dose as 120 millisieverts, with a reported range from 20 to 500. But an average is not a biography. A person working briefly at a monitored post and a person sent near highly contaminated debris did not receive the same exposure. Even that reported range spans a factor of 25. The work also changed over time. The people fighting fires in the first hours entered an uncontrolled scene. Later teams could use mapped contamination, task limits, shielding, and dose records, imperfect as those systems were. Calling all of them liquidators is historically useful, but medically it does not turn them into one exposure group. The date mattered as much as the job title. Radiation fields changed as short-lived isotopes decayed, debris moved, and shielding was built. A worker's arrival time, route, minutes spent near a source, protective equipment, and recorded dose all mattered more than the single label attached to the workforce. That difference is why the later health record must be described carefully. Among workers, studies give some indication of increased leukemia and radiation-related cataracts. Those are real findings, but the evidence does not show that every later cancer, heart attack, or early death in this enormous group was caused by Chernobyl. The clearest large cancer increase after the accident was thyroid cancer among people exposed as children or adolescents. especially through radioactive iodine in contaminated milk. That finding is central to Chernobyl's history, but it is not evidence that every adult plant worker met the same fate. Scientists can estimate additional risk across a population. They usually cannot look at one person's later cancer and prove which radiation exposure caused it. Normal cancer rates, changing healthcare, smoking, alcohol, and the wider mortality crisis in the former Soviet Union all complicate the record. That uncertainty cuts both ways. It would be wrong to label every later illness as a Chernobyl death. It would also be wrong to pretend that a risk too small to identify in one individual is no risk at all. Population evidence can reveal harm that no death certificate can name with certainty. That is why a single grand total may sound decisive, while hiding what the evidence can actually tell us. So, what happened to Chernobyl's workers? 2 died from the explosion and traumatic injuries. 28 highly exposed workers died from acute radiation syndrome in the next few months. Many other first responders survived for years or decades. The 3 men who drained the pressure-suppression pool did not die within days. And hundreds of thousands of later recovery workers lived with a wide range of exposures and risks, not one shared sentence. Chernobyl does not need a false ending to be tragic. The truthful ending is a timeline of unequal exposure, unequal damage, and individual lives that continued long after the cameras usually stop.